A madman lit the fuse of hatred. A king chained to his throne, and 20,000 lives marched into the desert furnace to defend an honor already rotten. Did Jerusalem fall because of the wrong moves? Or because the board itself was designed for everyone to lose? Baldwin IV of Jerusalem died of leprosy, and his death became the poison that consumed his kingdom. For 10 years, he ruled in relentless agony. A mask hiding a face falling apart, holding rival factions from tearing each other apart.
I'm not dead yet. He's been asking about you.
Who?
He wants to know what you're doing.
Baldwin IV arranged for his sister, Sibylla, the heir to the throne, to marry Guy of Lusignan, a noble aligned with the Courtenay faction. That marriage shifted the balance of power at court, pushing Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most powerful lords in the kingdom, to the sidelines, and forcing him to leave the realm. In the years that followed, relations between Baldwin IV and Guy grew increasingly strained. As the king neared death, he set aside his sister's claim in favor of her son, Baldwin V. And on his deathbed in 1185, Baldwin appointed Raymond as regent for the young king. When he drew his final breath, the kingdom began to fracture. Just 2 years later, Jerusalem fell. We often praise Baldwin IV of Jerusalem for holding the kingdom together, but here's the harder truth. His persistence created a kind of suspended system. Because he was too great, the kingdom never found a successor. Because he held on until the very end, rival factions never learned to compromise, only to wait for their moment to erupt. Baldwin did not save Jerusalem. He only delayed its fall at the cost of a stable transition of power. So, the question is not just how the death of a king changed history, but this: can a kingdom truly survive when its stability depends on a single man? Jerusalem began tearing itself apart from within. After the death of Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the throne of Jerusalem became a cursed prize. In the summer of 1186, Baldwin V of Jerusalem died suddenly. Soon after, Raymond III of Tripoli summoned the barons to Nablus to decide who should take the throne next. But while Raymond was in Nablus, the faction supporting Princess Sibylla of Jerusalem moved quickly. They seized control of Jerusalem and crowned Sibylla as queen. Raymond refused to accept this. He tried to put forward another claim, that of Isabella I of Jerusalem, Sibylla's half-sister and Isabella's husband, Humphrey IV of Toron. But the plan collapsed. Instead of siding with Raymond, Humphrey swore loyalty to Sibylla and her husband, Guy of Lusignan. And with that, the struggle for the throne was almost over at once. Sibylla kept the crown, and Guy remained in power as king. Raymond refused to submit to them, and instead aligned himself with Saladin, allowing Saladin to pass through Galilee during his campaigns against Jerusalem and to place a garrison in Tiberias, the capital of Galilee. But that decision did not bring peace, it ignited suspicion. In the eyes of Guy of Lusignan and the war faction, Raymond III of Tripoli was no longer an ally, but a man who could betray them at any moment. Only in the summer of 1187, when Saladin launched his full-scale invasion against the Crusaders, did Raymond finally reconcile with Guy. Don't see this as merely a quarrel between two men. This was the collapse of an entire model of rule. The feudal system of Jerusalem had been built for conquest, not for survival against a centralized empire. Raymond was not betraying the kingdom. He was acting on the instinct of a feudal lord. Protect his own lands first. Guy was not weak. He was acting on the instinct of a new king. Prove his authority through war. And that is where the tragedy lies. Both men were behaving logically according to their roles, but that very logic became poison to the kingdom as a whole. Saladin did not win by the sword alone. He won by forcing his enemies to reveal the fatal weakness of the feudal order, the moment private interest becomes greater than the fate of the nation. So the question is not who was right or wrong. The real question is, how long can a system survive when its greatest minds are busy fighting each other instead of facing a common enemy? Battle of Hattin did not begin in the desert. It began the moment they stopped trusting one another. So was the reconciliation between Raymond and Guy triggered by Saladin breaking the truce? No. That fire did not come from beyond the gates of Jerusalem. It was lit from within by the extremists inside the kingdom itself. In 1187, while the truce between Jerusalem and Saladin was still in force, a Hajj caravan crossed the desert, believing it was protected by the word of both sides. Then, without warning, Reynald of Châtillon tore that peace apart by attacking the pilgrims on their way to Mecca. He did not merely plunder them, he challenged the sacred itself. When the victims cried out in the name of the prophet, Reynald mocked them.
Tell him to come and save you.
Can one madman destroy a kingdom? Or was that kingdom already waiting for one to bring it down? That insult flew straight to Damascus. Saladin, who had spent years building the image of a ruler defined by restraint and mercy, rose and swore,
I will take his head with my own hand.
Within weeks, a war that diplomacy had long delayed became impossible to avoid. On the 2nd of July, 1187, Saladin launched his assault on Tiberias. At Sephoria, the last secure source of water, Guy de Lusignan calls a council of war. News arrives from the north. Tiberias is under siege by Saladin. Inside the city is the wife of Raymond III of Tripoli. Raymond steps forward, and he speaks clearly.
Do not march. Hold your ground. Force Saladin to fight us where we have water.
That was the most rational choice, the only choice with any chance of survival. But then, other voices rose. They called Raymond III of Tripoli a coward. They said a king who does not save his allies is unworthy of the crown. They said the honor of Jerusalem was at stake. And Guy of Lusignan remained silent. He looked around the council, not for a solution, but for approval. At last, he rose, not to defend Raymond's plan, but to follow the loudest voices in the room. He gave the order to march, a decision that abandoned strategy in exchange for honor. But if every path led to disaster, why did he choose the one that led there fastest? Under the scorching Levantine sun, the Crusader army, some 15,000 to 20,000 strong, marched into the dry wasteland, dragging with them infantry, heavy cavalry, and sacred relics. From the very beginning, the forces of Saladin appeared along the edges of their formation, not striking head-on, but harassing constantly, firing arrows and fading away. With every passing hour, the Crusaders moved slower, grew thirstier, and fell deeper into disorder. By July 3, the army of Guy of Lusignan could no longer reach the water at Sea of Galilee. They were forced to halt on a barren, dried-out plain near the hills of Battle of Hattin. At dawn on July 4, the Christian army rose and prepared to move. Raymond III of Tripoli once again took command of the vanguard, reinforced by troops from Antioch. The Latin forces were already demoralized, yet Saladin did not interfere with their preparations, perhaps uncertain whether they would attempt to push toward the village of Hattin or launch a desperate attack toward his camp. It is unclear exactly when the Muslim forces set fire to the dry brush, whether before the Crusaders formed ranks, at the opening of the battle, or as they withdrew toward the basin of Battle of Hattin. What is certain is that these fires were carefully prepared in advance, arranged in sequence to be ignited as the enemy advanced. There are also accounts suggesting that wells and water sources had been sabotaged the night before, further tightening the trap around the Crusader army. A number of experienced knights, some of whom had previously served with Muslim forces, urged Guy of Lusignan to launch an immediate attack against Saladin's position. But their advice was dismissed, and the army continued marching toward Hattin, still several miles away. The situation grew so dire that 6 knights and several sergeants abandoned the ranks and defected to Saladin, informing him that the moment was ideal to strike. Seizing the opportunity, Saladin committed his center and possibly the left wing under Gukbari to the attack. The Knights Templar fought back fiercely, while the vanguard under Raymond III of Tripoli engaged the right wing commanded by Taqi al-Din, which was blocking their path. In the opening moments of the battle, Saladin also lost a young commander named Manguras, serving under Taqi al-Din on the right. Manguras reportedly charged ahead and engaged in single combat with a champion knight, was unhorsed and beheaded. Other accounts claim he was surrounded and cut down by multiple enemies. The Christian army advanced in its standard formation, with lines of infantry including crossbowmen shielding the cavalry. The cavalry managed to repel Saladin's initial assault, but at the cost of many war horses. Worse still, the infantry line broke, and some units scattered eastward. Muslim sources also agree that many thirst-stricken soldiers fled towards Sea of Galilee, even though it was much farther away than the springs near Hattin. That night, Saladin encamped at Lubia to the south. His ultimate objective was clear: to prevent the Christian army from reaching any water source, whether the village of Hattin to the northeast or the lake to the east. A plausible explanation is that Taqi al-Din blocked the route toward Hattin by holding the entrance to the valley up to the Nimrin Hills, while the central force of Saladin stretched from the valley entrance to the Lubia Hills, cutting off access to Tiberias. At the same time, the contingent under Gukbari positioned itself between Lubia and Jabal Turan, blocking any retreat westward toward the village of Turan. Anchoring cavalry formations against mountainous terrain was a common Turkic tactic, while encircling a central hill was more typical of infantry strategy. Clearly, Saladin feared the Latin army might break through toward Tiberias, so he ordered that they be stopped at all costs. Thus, Raymond III of Tripoli's initial charge likely disrupted the coordination between Saladin's center and Taqi al-Din's wing. Had that breach widened, the fleeing infantry moving east might have reached the waters of Tiberias, visible to their right, beyond the valley. To prevent this, Saladin would have pushed forces across his right flank to seal the gap. In an attempt to stabilize the situation, Guy of Lusignan ordered the army to halt and make camp, but the chaos was so great that only 3 tents were erected, somewhere near the base of the hills to the west or southwest of the valley. Meanwhile, the smoke from the burning brush did its work, stinging the eyes of the Crusaders and intensifying their thirst. Seasonal winds blowing from the west carried the smoke directly into their lines, as Muslim Mutawiya fighters set fires along the ridges between Jabal Turan and Nimrin. Even the Muslim forces around the valley had to endure the smoke, but withdrawing would have risked opening a gap between Saladin and Taqi al-Din, something he could not allow. At dawn on July 4, the Christian army rose and prepared to move. Raymond III of Tripoli once again took command of the vanguard, reinforced by troops from Antioch. The Latin forces were already demoralized, yet Saladin did not interfere with their preparations, perhaps uncertain whether they would attempt to push toward the village of Hattin or launch a desperate attack toward his camp. It is unclear exactly when the Muslim forces set fire to the dry brush, whether before the Crusaders formed ranks, at the opening of the battle, or as they withdrew toward the basin of Battle of Hattin. What is certain is that these fires were carefully prepared in advance, arranged in sequence to be ignited as the enemy advanced. There are also accounts suggesting that wells and water sources had been sabotaged the night before, further tightening the trap around the Crusader army. The Christian line quickly fell into chaos. Most of the infantry fled toward the bay at Battle of Hattin, clustering in the northern sector. At the same time, when Taqi al-Din allowed Raymond III of Tripoli to break through, a temporary gap opened to the south. Some soldiers may have tried to escape that way, but the opening was quickly sealed, forcing them back north. There, morale collapsed completely. The infantry refused to return and support the cavalry. Even when Guy of Lusignan and the clergy called on them to defend the true cross, they would not fight, overcome by thirst and exhaustion. With the infantry gone, the cavalry lost its protective screen. War horses were shot down by archers, forcing knights to fight on foot under brutal conditions. Guy had no choice but to order a stand south of the valley. The royal tents visible from afar became the final rallying point. Amid the chaos, the true cross was lost, a devastating blow to Crusader morale. By now, the Muslim forces tightened the encirclement and attacked from all sides. Infantry pressed into the northern pocket, forcing surrender or annihilation. In the south, Taqi al-Din led troops up the slopes, coordinating with Saladin to strike the last position of the knights. Though there were still fierce counterattacks, even moments when some knights nearly reached Saladin, these were nothing more than desperate, final efforts. After the Battle of Hattin, Reynaud of Châtillon was brought before Saladin alongside Guy of Lusignan. Saladin offered water to Guy, a sign of mercy and protection. But when it came to Reynaud, he refused. He recalled Reynaud's repeated violations of truces, especially the attack on a Hajj caravan, the act that had ignited the war. Saladin gave him a choice: convert or die. Reynaud refused. Moments later, he was executed. After escaping the defeat at Battle of Hattin, Balian of Ibelin understood one thing clearly: the war was over. Not with victory, but for Jerusalem itself. No army remains, no hope remains. To keep fighting is only to delay the inevitable. He did not seek glory. He wanted only one final thing: to get his family out of Jerusalem safely. Balian of Ibelin went to Saladin. And this time, he came not as an enemy, but as a father. Saladin granted him passage with one clear condition: leave the city and never take up arms against him again. Balian accepted. But when he entered Jerusalem, nothing was as he expected. No army, no leadership, only a city waiting to collapse. The people looked to him as their last hope. They begged him to stay. Balian of Ibelin was caught between honor and responsibility. Patriarch Heraclius of Jerusalem released him from his oath, declaring defending Jerusalem mattered more than a promise to an enemy. And Balian chose to stay. But the reality was even harsher. All of Jerusalem had barely more than 10 knights left. So he did the unthinkable. He knighted around 60 townsmen, not because they were ready to fight, but because there was no one else. From that moment on, Balian was no longer a survivor. He became the last commander of Jerusalem. The people and the nobles swore loyalty to him. Together with Heraclius, he began preparing for the inevitable siege, stockpiling food, gathering ransom funds, and reinforcing every section of the walls. After the Battle of Hattin, most of Jerusalem's fighting force had been wiped out. Saladin wasted no time. He moved swiftly through the coastal and inland cities: Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, many of which surrendered with barely any resistance. Within weeks, the road to Jerusalem lay open. But Saladin did not rush the city. He paused. He observed. Jerusalem was not just a target. It was a fortress built over centuries. He studied the terrain, the weakest sections of the walls, the positions of the gates, the areas where siege engines could be placed. He calculated the most effective line of attack, how to cut off supplies completely, and more importantly, how to force the city to surrender before it was destroyed. Inside Jerusalem, the situation was the opposite. The remaining defenders were few. No real army, no clear plan. The man who stepped forward was Balian of Ibelin, a noble, with no choice left but to fight. One side, preparing a calculated siege. The other, simply trying to buy time. And between them, stood Jerusalem. Before September 20, Saladin and his engineers had time to study the walls of Jerusalem while the army made camp. The next morning, they launched their first assault on the northwest corner, between Jaffa Gate and Damascus Gate. Fighting erupted almost immediately. Arrows filled the air as siege engines began pounding the walls and towers. The defenders fought fiercely. They did not only resist from the ramparts, but also launched several counterattacks, opening the gates to destroy siege equipment and push back the attackers. Despite the damage caused by the bombardment, for 5 days Saladin failed to create a decisive breach. Terrain and shifting light at times favored the defenders, while the Muslim forces employed more subtle tactics, such as casting sand with the wind to disrupt their enemies. Still, their own losses were not insignificant. By the 25th, seeing no progress, Saladin halted the western assault and withdrew. But just a day later, he shifted focus to the northern sector, a weaker stretch of the defenses. Muslim forces quickly established forward positions and concentrated their attacks around Damascus Gate, considered the most vulnerable point despite its double wall system. This time, Saladin changed tactics. Dozens of siege engines were deployed in continuous bombardment, including more powerful counterweight trebuchets. At the same time, well-protected engineering teams advanced to the base of the walls and began mining operations. They constructed wooden coverings and dug a tunnel over 30 meters long, then burned its supports to collapse the foundations. On September 29, a large section of the northern wall finally gave way. Under relentless fire from arrows and stones, the defenders could neither repair the breach nor mount an effective counterattack, and the Muslim army opened a path into the city. After days of bombardment, Jerusalem stood on the brink of being taken by force. And if that happened, the result would be a massacre. Balian of Ibelin understood this. He asked to negotiate. Balian met with Saladin. He issued a warning. If the city were stormed, its people would destroy the holy sites before they died. After days of negotiation, an agreement was reached. Jerusalem would surrender. Its people could leave if they paid a ransom. Those who could not would be taken into slavery. On the 2nd of October 1187, Jerusalem officially fell. There was no massacre like in 1099, but there was no victory for those inside the city either. The events of 1,187 sent shockwaves across Europe. The loss of Jerusalem became a humiliation for the entire Christian world. The Battle of Hattin shattered the feudal structure and the foundations of the kingdom for good. In its aftermath, Western European influence over royal authority began to rise rapidly. On the Muslim side, the liberation of Jerusalem elevated the prestige of Saladin to its peak. Amid this surge of enthusiasm, a caravan set out for Cairo along the coastal route for the first time in 78 years, without having to pay tribute or tolls. Many see Guy of Lusignan as the man who made one of the most foolish decisions in history when he left Sephoria and marched into the desert. But if we place ourselves in his position at that moment, is the answer really so simple? Guy was not facing only the swords of Saladin. He was also facing a throne already trembling beneath him. If he chose to remain in place and preserve the army, would he have kept his crown once he was branded a coward, a king who abandoned his allies and proved himself unworthy to lead? In a kingdom already divided, hesitation could be more dangerous than a wrong decision. People often romanticize Saladin as the image of nobility and mercy. But history always holds colder shadows behind the glow of legend. Saladin was an extraordinary leader, but above all, he was ruthlessly pragmatic. He knew how to use religion to unite tribes that had long torn each other apart, how to use morality to legitimize a brutal war, and how to turn faith into his sharpest political weapon. When faith grows so powerful that it strips away even the most basic instinct to survive, is that the elevation of the soul or a form of religious suicide? At Battle of Hattin, what killed the Crusader army was not only Saracen arrows or blades, it was a deadly union of honor, peer pressure, and blind faith. Saladin won because he knew how to wait, how to lure, and how to punish. But Jerusalem had already begun to lose from within through a divided system and egos too large to look in the same direction. Hattin always leaves us haunted by the question of what if? If just one decision at Sephoria had been different, if just one summer rain had fallen across the Levant at the right moment, would history have turned another way? When reason and the instinct to survive were screaming for them to stop, the cries of "God wills it" and knightly honor commanded them to march on. And in the end, the very things that had once made them the most formidable warriors in the world became the rope that led them into the furnace of the desert.